How frozen I became, and powerless then. These are the words of Dante the poet in the final circle of hell as he stares into the three-headed visage of Satan himself. There is nothing more poignant in storytelling than the feeling of powerlessness and smallness that we feel in the face of overwhelming forces beyond our comprehension. The works of H.P. Lovecraft unlock this fear too, as he deals with beings whose mere existence can unravel the minds of all who look upon them. And somewhere along this road of terror and helplessness lies Shin Godzilla. Shin Godzilla is a 2016 film co-directed by Hideki Anno and Shinji Higuchi, who are most known for their work on the anime Neon Genesis Evangelion. Hideki Anno in particular initially turned this project down because his mental health had been declining at that point. However, it was his wife who had convinced him to take on the Godzilla movie. And so he and Shinji got together and made the most terrifying version of the character, both before and since. And I talked about this in my previous video talking about every version of Godzilla ever, which... But the word Shin in this context can mean a few different things. It can mean real, referring to this version of Godzilla as the one true Godzilla. It can mean evolved, which is something that we will talk about later. And it can also mean God, which would set this version of the character apart as a cosmic force beyond our understanding and our comprehension, which also works quite well. As we will see in the events of this movie, all three of them are probably true to some degree. And as for me, Shin Godzilla is my favorite version of the character ever. Of course, I haven't seen Godzilla -1 yet, so this is subject to change. It is simultaneously a fantastic tribute to the original 1954 film. It is a radical, new, and horrifying twist on that character, and woven through it all, it is a scathing indictment of the Japanese government at the time. It was a vehicle for Hideki at the time to channel the pain and the depression that he was feeling, but it also serves as a love letter to the person who got him through it all. This is the story of Shin Godzilla. So let's get into it. But before I begin, I want to explain something very important about the story. You see, while this movie received lots of praise in Japan, it was met with mixed reviews out in the West. The main complaint was that there is so little Godzilla in this Godzilla movie. It just takes you from meeting to conference room to meeting. The main focus of this movie is on the human characters, which normally puts me off of Godzilla movies, but in this case I think it works extremely well. And the reason for that is one very specific reason. As I briefly mentioned in my previous video, this movie is first and foremost a scathing indictment of the Japanese government and their response to the triple disaster event of 2011. You see, in March, Japan was hit with a magnitude 9 earthquake. While the epicenter of this quake was in the middle of the ocean, it still caused massive destruction and lots of deaths in Japan. This event was so big that it shifted the tilt of the Earth's axis. It moved the entire island of Japan a couple meters, which is a very big deal, and it forever changed the rotation speed of the Earth itself. But this was only the beginning. This sudden and violent shift in tectonic plates also hurled massive tsunamis at the coast of Japan. One of these waves was up to 33 meters tall and was hurled 6 miles or 10 kilometers inland. As a result of these disasters, nearly 20,000 people were killed, but this was still not the end, because the combination of the earthquake and the tsunami resulted in a critical loss of power at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. They attempted a shutdown, but they didn't have enough power to cool all of the radioactive material, and as a result, this radioactive material exploded into the air, shooting radioactive clouds and materials all over the place. While no lives were lost in this initial incident, a few people were killed in the resulting mass evacuation. This was a massive tragedy, and I cannot imagine the fear that the Japanese people felt in the wake of these events. But another thing the Japanese people felt in the wake of this was anger, particularly anger at their government and their slow response to this situation. Many people felt if the government had acted quicker or made different decisions in the wake of this incident, then maybe some lives might have been saved. And this is the accusation that became the inspiration for Shin Godzilla. And as such, he embodies all of the power, destruction, and terror that was this triple disaster. Even the attack itself occurs in 3 stages, which we will see later. And maybe they would have had a chance at stopping Godzilla if they had only acted faster. I can appreciate this movie's focus on its human characters because of what they are trying to say about their people and their government. But that's all I'll say for now, because now we are going to get into the story of Shin Godzilla. We begin in Tokyo Bay, where the Coast Guard has found a pleasure yacht adrift in the bay. And then we transition into first-person, almost found footage as the Coast Guard boards the ship to investigate. The ship is entirely abandoned and an origami crane. The owner's shoes are placed neatly below deck. There is no sign of struggles, and as they debate, something appears to strike the hull of the ship. And we cut to a distance further away to see that the yacht and all of the members of the Coast Guard on board it have been pulled into the ocean by a massive geyser. We then cut to dashcam footage of someone driving in the Tokyo Aqualine, which is a tunnel that goes underneath Tokyo Bay. And as the person drives, a huge rift in the roof above opens, but rather than water pouring into the chasm, we see that tons of blood is now pouring. Deputy Chief of Cabinet Security. And of course, he has been alerted to the fracture in the Aqualine. He is assembling the cabinet, and the Prime Minister is on his... And this meeting is basically just discussing what on earth is going on. This could be the result of an underwater earthquake or eruption. Not footage of what looks like a massive creature slowly slithering back into the water. I'm switching hands, trying to decide what is going on in Tokyo, being boiling steam. So it could be a hydrothermal vent has opened up in the bay. But Yaguchi disputes this, saying that geological surveys have identified that the source of this eruption is above the Aqualine, that this is in fact a giant creature. This is immediately dismissed if they need conclusive evidence, so for now they will be treating this as a volcanic event, which has also been disproven, but I guess it's more believable than a whale. Having made the decision that they can't decide on anything, they convene this meeting to assemble the cabinet for another meeting. It truly is a biting satire of government. So now for the meeting's meeting. Emergency responders are on site and waiting for anything to happen. All flights have been canceled, and the coastal region is prepared for an evacuation. And after hours of being in this same meeting, they finally come to the decision that the mist is not toxic. So, great. And the Coast Guard will be leading an investigation into the source of this event. But as they talk, they receive a report that the eruption is subsiding. Yaguchi reiterates his concern that it may be a large creature, but he is dismissed and kind of laughed off until they turn on the TV and are greeted with news footage and see that a giant tail has erupted from the bay and is swaying in the air. And suddenly, the cabinet takes Yaguchi far more seriously. And so the meeting is adjourned so the Prime Minister can have another meeting with the other ministers of government. So now we're at the meeting. And all they know so far is that this creature is unknown. So great. They are in the process of reaching out to qualified biologists to give their opinions on this creature, as well as planning an emergency summit so that the government can at least acknowledge what's going on. This is an unprecedented situation, and so they are unsure how to best respond. The three prevailing options are to just let the creature go and hope that it does. They can capture it and exterminate it, or they can try and chase it off. Most of the people in this meeting want to see it exterminated. Between the closing of the Aqua Line, the shutting down of flights, and the various other measures they have taken, the economic impact of this creature is already tremendous. So the quicker they deal with this thing, the better. They debate assembling the Japan Self-Defense Forces, but this is unprecedented because they have never been called to arms in response to a wildlife event before. Meanwhile, academics and environmentalists are of course calling for the study of the creature rather than the extermination of it. Yaguchi demands that someone just do something, please. But no one has any idea what department would even head something like this. But as they debate and get nowhere, the creature begins swimming upstream towards the Tama River, leaving a trail of blood in its wake. But in the meantime, 3 biologists are assembled who can finally give their opinions on anything, on what this is. Hopefully. The first is unsure because of the limited footage available. It could either be some kind of dinosaur, some aquatic dinosaur, or an ancient species of whale that we haven't discovered yet. The second only says that it is an unknown aquatic species, which, again, duh. And the third refuses to say anything until he knows for certain that this isn't a hoax. He is more concerned about preserving his reputation as a biologist than preventing a future disaster. And then we cut to the river where it appears the creature is forcing its way through and destroying everything in its path. The biologists were useless, so Yaguchi brings in someone else. And that, of course, is Hiromi Ogashira. She is the deputy chief of the Nature Conservation Bureau. And surprise, surprise, she is much more useful than those 3 biologists. She identifies that despite this creature having gills, it does also have massive rear legs, indicating it does have some amphibious traits. And thus, it is entirely possible that this creature could come onto land. Meanwhile, the government still hasn't decided what agency should act on this situation. And if you couldn't tell by now, this is another meeting. Their anonymous experts who definitely know what they're talking about say that it's totally impossible for this creature to come on land. They say that the creature is so massive that its legs would simply be crushed under the weight of this thing. However, as Ogashira rightly says, the creature is already walking, it's just still in the water. Even so, the Minister of Environment doubles down. It is impossible for this creature to walk on land. The cabinet insists that the Prime Minister make a public statement to at least calm public fears. However, they can only convey verified information, and they know nothing. Meanwhile, the creature is still rampaging through the river. Its intense thrashing is causing flooding as boats and water is tossed over the shoreline and into the city. This is the first stage of Godzilla's disaster, the first of 3 to come, mimicking the triple disaster of 2011. And at the press conference, the Prime Minister addresses the public, but only with verified information. The Aqua Line and the Tama River are damaged, and the creature is currently making its way up the River Nomi. The creature is unidentified, but it is believed that when it reaches shallower waters, its legs will be crushed by its own weight. There is no way that this creature will ever come ashore. And then hard cut to... This first look at the creature is terrifying. It has enormous bulging eyes like a fish. Its gills are massive and swollen. And it has very messy, hooked, sharp teeth like some breeds of sharks do. Obviously, this is not a good situation for the Prime Minister either, because it shows that him and his government know nothing about what they are facing. The intention was to quell public fears, but now the public is more scared than ever. I hope my lighting still looks good. The sun went away on me. We're just gonna roll with it. Meanwhile, the creature is continuing further inland, its swollen gills spilling gallons of blood on the street as it walks. Meanwhile, the government has another meeting. to decide on an outpost for crisis management. One character does call out how annoying it is that every decision, big or small, requires a meeting beforehand. But another responds saying that bureaucracy is the heart of democracy, and so he has no right to complain. Which is totally fair. Without these processes, democracy can quickly slip into tyranny, but man, you really just could have bombed this creature by now. They then hold a press conference to say that in a meeting, they decided on a headquarters. Ooh. And they are urging the public to take refuge there. They say that they are working on a response to this creature, but as they are saying this, buildings are being demolished by the creature. But never mind that, because we're at another meeting now. Based on its current speed, they estimate that it could arrive in Tokyo in 3 hours. Which sounds like a long time, but given the amount of meetings that this government has, that's nothing. And with Tokyo being as populated as it is, they will need to mass evacuate everyone from the city before extermination can even be considered. However, because of bureaucracy, there is no precedent for traffic control under these conditions. And so the public will simply have to evacuate itself, which I'm sure will go very well. And while the citizens of the Shinagawa ward evacuate, the creature is among them, destroying buildings. It's dragging itself along the ground like a fish out of water, thrashing from side to side. In this first stage, Godzilla is still amphibious. He has 2 massive rear legs with tiny stubbles in the front that resemble forearms. Unable to walk properly, it thrashes against the side of an apartment building, killing many. We then cut to the government, which is really trying to come up with a response. They know that their only good option is to summon the Japan Self-Defense Force, but there is no precedent for responding to a crisis on Japanese soil. This isn't an armed attack, nor is it a rival country. It's just a creature. And there is also the need to evacuate all citizens before any military action is taken. And the assembly of these troops can only be ordered by the Prime Minister. The use of military is needed, but will result in collateral damage, which will reflect badly on the Prime Minister. Protecting the citizens is top priority, and they need the Prime Minister's go-ahead to proceed. And so the Prime Minister declares a state of emergency, meaning that the self-defense forces can now act on Japanese soil. Ground troops are aiding with the evacuation while they assemble helicopters to combat the creature. They need to be careful. If even one civilian is hurt or killed in this operation, it will hurt their government forever. The operation will be on 2 fronts. Ground forces will aid with the evacuation, while the helicopters will be the primary strike force. Jets are on standby if needed, but missiles will only cause more destruction. There is also the matter of the sick and elderly that are difficult to transport. They will need to stay behind, but in doing so, they will be put at greater risk. So far, both me and the movie have been very critical of the government's response up until this point, but this scene really does showcase the impossible situation that they are dealing with. No matter what they do, destruction and death lay ahead, and they are uncertain of which path will lead to more. And all the while, Godzilla continues to crawl around the city while citizens run and scream in terror. And then suddenly, it rears up on its hind legs and then collapses. Its skin begins to ripple and darken, and slowly, very shakily, it stands up completely on its rear legs. The flesh around his stubs peels away, revealing these clawed forearms. Meanwhile, he grows immensely in size, his skin taking on a more darker hue. The flesh around the mouth and jaw of this thing are very bloody, as if the innards of this creature are being forced to the outside. Godzilla has now evolved to the second stage that we see in the movie, and he is now bipedal. Bipedal? Either way. And the roar that they use for Godzilla, as well as the soundtrack that plays in the background, I believe, is taken from the original 1954 movie, which I just think is really cool. Having completed this transformation, Godzilla continues to rampage. But hopefully not for long, because choppers are now inbound. But they don't immediately attack because the creature that they see is not the creature that they were briefed on, and so they hold and await further orders. Civilians are evacuated and the choppers are ready. All they need is the Prime Minister's word to proceed. But just as he gives the order to fire, 2 civilians are seen in the firing line. They are faced with a decision. Do they open fire and risk killing these 2 civilians? Or do they hold fire and risk Godzilla causing even more damage? Of course, they choose to save the lives of the 2. The choppers pull back, and Godzilla's back begins to heat up until it glows a bright red. With that, he lets out a huge roar, smashes through a building, and runs on all 4s at top speed back to Tokyo Bay. And so, Godzilla is allowed to escape. While I think that they absolutely made the right decision in saving those 2 lives, I will say that if the Japanese military had any chance of taking out Godzilla with missiles and bullets, that was it. And any future responses by the military comes far, far too late. But with that, Tokyo returns to normal. Trains begin operating again, foreign aid is brought in from other countries, the stock exchange opens again, everything returns to normal. The attack lasted 2 hours, 100 people are dead, and not a single shot was fired at the creature. This again is a reference to the triple disaster of 2011. By the time the government had already decided on a course of action, the damage, sadly, was already done. Hang on, I'm gonna see something real quick. Just changing my lighting because the sun disappeared on me. Even the devastation brought on by Godzilla was designed to look like disaster photos from 2011. Japanese boats are now scouring the ocean for any signs of this creature. Patrols are monitoring the sea as well as the many islands around Japan. Meanwhile, the military is trying to devise a strategy to eliminate this creature should it resurface. The prevailing strategy is just shoot it with everything. The main priority is preserving city centers. We then see a conversation discussing the gross GDP, or gross domestic product for all of you nerds, of Tokyo. This may seem very detached from the destruction of Godzilla, but it puts into perspective his economic impact as well. It is a very realistic take on the monster. Not only would Godzilla be very damaging to the infrastructure of a city, but if he attacked a major city center like Tokyo, his economic impact would be severe. Hundreds of trillions of yen are at stake in this. And so they will try and protect Tokyo's industry as well. It is here that a task force is created, a task force with the sole purpose of researching and discovering new things about Godzilla, a team that is led by Yaguchi. They prepare an office space complete with tables and computers and printers, anything that they will need. They are given the limited information that the government does know, and then they are put to work. The first good piece of information from this team is that this creature is rapidly evolving. We have seen 3 versions of the creature so far. Its tadpole stage in Tokyo Bay, its amphibious stage when it crawled onto land, and then its bipedal stage. And their prediction is that there will be more to come, which probably. A tissue sample was retrieved, but the Americans took it for their own research. Its path through the city does not indicate any form of intelligence. It appears to just have been a creature that crawled out of the ocean and then ran back. But the big question is how a creature like that gets its energy. You see, as many Godzilla haters will be quick to tell you, a creature like that would be impossible in the real world. And one of the reasons for that is the astronomical amount of energy it would take for a creature of that size simply to stand up. If its metabolic system used oxygen like ours does, it would simply be crushed under its own weight and die immediately. And so Hiromi makes the hypothesis that this creature's metabolic system is powered by nuclear fission. This is understandably laughed off, but just wait. The Americans were the first ones to detect this, but radiation levels in the city of Tokyo have increased. There's no reactor leaks in the area, so no one knows what this could be. And suddenly, in the task force office, the person who initially laughed at the notion of nuclear fission has a eureka moment. Like, he screams, he spins around in his chair, and he starts running all around the room, finally bringing his computer to the attention of Yaguchi and Hiromi. And sure enough, the radiation spikes are strongest along the path of destruction caused by Godzilla. This is pretty damning evidence that Godzilla's metabolic system is somehow powered by some nuclear process. And whatever it is, news of the radiation found on site is all over the internet now. The Secretary of Cabinet is notified, and he believes that the Prime Minister should hold a press conference in response to this to kind of quell public fears of radiation. This is a sensible decision, but boy is everyone else in that room dumb. They say that there's no evidence that this creature is radioactive, which, yeah, there is. However, they do make the point that radiation levels are not high enough to pose any risk or warrant any evacuation, which is good. And eventually they all listen to Yaguchi. The sooner they respond to this issue, the better. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has just gotten off the phone with the President of the United States. He had many demands, but one of which was that the Prime Minister have a meeting with one of his diplomats. But first, this diplomat wants to talk to Yaguchi. She is Kayoko Ann Patterson, an American-born Japanese diplomat. She has read up extensively on Yaguchi and believes that they could work well together. She also comes bearing information, the name of a man who predicted the arrival of this creature years ago. And that is a biologist by the name of Goro Maki, and it appears he arrived in Japan about a week ago. She proposes a two-way line of communication between Yaguchi's task force and US intelligence. He agrees to this deal and they get back to work. And in another room, two other men are discussing Goro Maki, the man who predicted Godzilla. He was exiled from Japan and worked for years at a nuclear energy company in America. He obviously had special knowledge of this creature, and so they are trying to find a way to reach him. However, the news that they get back is not what they were hoping for. You see, remember the yacht from the very beginning of the movie, where it was assumed that the captain of which had simply fallen into the sea? That man was Goro Maki, and it appears that he went out into the bay to drown himself. And all that he left was a note written on the outside of an envelope in his yacht. It says, "I did as I pleased. Now you do the same." Yaguchi passes this information to Kayoko and US intelligence, and in turn they get more information on him from the Americans. You see, the US Department of Energy already has a name for this creature, Godzilla. This is an American code name. The original name for this creature was scrawled on the outside of that same letter in Goro's handwriting, and that name is Gojira. On Odo Island, the island where Goro lived and taught for years, that name translates to God incarnate. The name quickly spreads to Japanese news outlets, so now I can finally start calling the creature Godzilla, or Gojira, because that's the original name. We are then shown some important history from 60 years ago. The task force finds images of unsanctioned dumps of nuclear waste into the Pacific Ocean, and underwater photos show that some of these barrels were damaged, almost as if a large creature bit into them. The US Department of Energy concluded that Godzilla was feeding on this nuclear waste. Goro Maki apparently had made plenty of inquiries to various nuclear energy plants about this waste. The prevailing theory now is that some ancient underwater creature became acclimated to this nuclear waste and even began consuming it. And as a result, it began rapidly mutating into the creature that we see now. And when its body grew enough, it left the ocean and came up on land. In the task force room, one of Kayoko's assistants unrolls a large paper onto the table. It is a diagram with very dense pathways to the point where nothing is recognizable. This is a diagram of Godzilla's molecular structure, which is unlike anything that the task force has ever seen. And so with this incomplete picture, the task force doubles their efforts. But now back to politics, because boy do I miss that. With the US government pressuring them, Japan finally passes security policies that pertain to Godzilla. It seems that the US is leveraging their knowledge of Godzilla in order to pass policies in Japan, which they wouldn't do that. What are you talking about? The US would never do that. I'm gonna get JFK'd one day. Now back at the task force, they are analyzing the tissue samples found of Godzilla. While most life is made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, it appears that Godzilla is made of entirely new elements, elements that we have never discovered. And the reason that the US acted so quickly was because of the potential of these new elements to make bombs or something, I don't know, probably weapons. And on the TV, the Prime Minister is holding a press conference. This is the one where he informs the public that the radiation left behind by Godzilla is not lethal. And also not harmful either. Maybe. Meanwhile, the task force discovers that Godzilla has 8 times the amount of genetic information that humans do. Its DNA is so dense that it could take years to sequence it. Whatever this creature is, it is the most advanced creature on the planet, and it is capable of spontaneously and rapidly changing its biology. But while this thing is indeed beyond our comprehension, it is still a living organism, which means hypothetically, it can still be killed. And one of the big questions coming from its initial attack is why did it suddenly rapidly turn and run back to the bay? And that's when they have the revelation that it needed to do this in order to cool down. If it truly is fueled by nuclear fission, then it is generating massive, unfathomable levels of heat. And when we last saw Godzilla, right before it fled back to the sea, its back had begun to glow a bright red, meaning it was probably reaching extremely high temperatures and ran back to the bay in order to cool itself. They also theorized that its back plates and its circulatory system, in other words its blood, are also used to cool down this creature. But when that isn't enough, it retreats back to the ocean to cool down even more. If this theory is true, then it may be possible to stop this creature using a blood coagulant. In other words, a mixture that entirely clots the bloodstream. If they can do this, they may be able to quite literally freeze Godzilla in place. And so with this, they start developing what they initially call the Yaguchi Plan, which is a plan to develop and administer a coagulant capable of freezing Godzilla. Meanwhile, on the streets, there are massive protests to preserve Godzilla, which... why? They are calling for the government to preserve Godzilla rather than exterminate him. But it seems they are about to eat their words because Godzilla's back. And he has now entered his 4th stage, or the 3rd that we've seen, so the completion of the triple disaster parallel. Its skin is now completely black, with its innards almost exploding to the outside. Its legs are now gigantic, much more suited to a creature this size. Its tail is even longer than Godzilla is tall, and it sways hypnotically behind him. Its eyes have turned blue and shrunk into its head. Its teeth are still sharp and hooked. Its silhouette is very similar to the original 1954 Godzilla, but this is very clearly a different Godzilla and is by far my favorite design of Godzilla I have ever seen. He has returned to Tokyo Bay and is heading towards the city. And the music that plays during this sequence is an old theme from the 1954 movie, which again, I love it. I love it. The country enters red alert and evacuation order is sounded as Godzilla steps onto land. Its movements to me also are really cool. While this is an entirely CGI Godzilla, they still manage to capture the physicality of a man in a suit. It's very uncanny in that way and very nostalgic. And the shots from the ground of Godzilla towering over everyone are also really well done. It looks insanely cool. An emergency meeting with the Prime Minister is convened because Godzilla is making a line straight for Tokyo and destroying everything in his path. It has completely changed its appearance and has doubled in size to a whopping 389 feet. Public workers continue to evacuate citizens to shelters because in 3 hours, Godzilla will arrive in Tokyo. Progress on the Yaguchi plan is slow, so the self-defense force assembles to respond. And they are now authorized to use any force necessary to destroy Godzilla. Their goal is to keep him out of the city of Tokyo. The Tama River is their last line of defense. And so they assemble the tanks, helicopters, and jets. Its core is insanely radioactive, but if they shoot for the head and the legs, then they should be fine. After confirming the area is totally evacuated, the helicopters start hitting Godzilla with everything they've got, but all of their bullets bounce harmlessly off of Godzilla's thick skin. And so they switch to missiles, which do explode upon contact, but don't seem to damage or hurt it in any way. And so they switch to tank rounds and artillery, but those don't work either. Like I said before, if there was any chance of stopping Godzilla with tanks and jets, that time has long since passed. Unfazed, Godzilla arrives at the Tama River, their last line of defense. They pull back the tanks and drop bombs on it. While these don't hurt it, it does seem to try and turn and flee. Not satisfied with this, they keep dropping bombs on it, of course. Now truly enraged, Godzilla hurls a massive bridge at the line of tanks. Godzilla has now crossed the Tama River and is entering the city of Tokyo. Their defense has failed, and the evacuation of the city center is not complete, so all military action is suspended. Night begins to fall on Tokyo, and as the light dims, we see that Godzilla still is glowing with a brilliant red light. The self-defense force was unable to bring it down, and so they turn to the US for help. And so the US sends their planes with even bigger bombs. Of course, it appears that America's bombing plan will cause even more destruction than Godzilla has, and so Japan hurriedly evacuates everyone to underground shelters. Godzilla steps on the power grid and the entire city goes dark. It appears he is heading for government headquarters, and so the Prime Minister is urged to flee. He refuses, though. It appears he sees it as his duty to oversee the completion of the bombing and the evacuation, which is a really good moment for the Prime Minister. For all the times he has maybe made mistakes with Godzilla, it does appear that he cares about the people he represents and is trying to see them to safety. But everyone else evacuates, including the task force led by Yaguchi. Traffic at this point is fully blocked off, so Yaguchi is forced to evacuate through the subway, but as he gets out of his car, he hears the loud stomping of Godzilla through the city, and for the first time, with his own eyes, he sees Godzilla. And the stomping sound, much like his roar, is taken from the original movie, which I think is so cool. I keep saying it, but it keeps being cool, so deal with it. But enough of that, because the Americans have begun their bombing campaign, and 2 bombs actually do strike Godzilla and penetrate the skin and explode. And this visibly hurts Godzilla. We see blood spurt out into the air and gallons of it begin to pour into the street. The cabinet cheers on this temporary victory, and the Prime Minister finally boards his chopper to evacuate. Godzilla roars in pain and then turns his head downwards. The glow on his back becomes brighter and hotter, transforming from a red into a brilliant purple. It seems that all the bombs succeeded in doing was supercharging Godzilla for this moment. Yaguchi wonders what this glow could mean, but he won't have to wonder for long. As this somber operatic music starts to play, Godzilla opens his mouth, his lower jaw splitting into 2 pieces. It's such a cool and terrifying design. I love it. It really feels like Godzilla in this movie is this like eldritch being that defies understanding, and it's terrifying, and I love it. And for me, this is the coolest scene in any Godzilla movie ever. Again, I haven't seen -1 yet, so not counting that. Godzilla unleashes a cloud of smoke and gas from his mouth, and as a protective lid rolls over his eyes, that gas ignites into a brilliant and powerful flame. A flame that envelops an entire district of Tokyo and destroys everything in its path. Slowly, this blaze becomes concentrated, focusing into a beam of pure white energy. And so Godzilla turns its head upwards and slices the bombers that attacked it. It is in this scene that Godzilla truly lives up to the meaning of his name as God incarnate. Not God in a religious sense, but in a more mythological and almost Lovecraftian sense. The flame in its mouth extinguishes, but Godzilla is still burning with power, and more bombs are being dropped on it, when suddenly dozens of atomic beams burst out of Godzilla's back. This destroys both the bombs falling to it and the bombers that launched them. And with its mouth, it continues destroying the entire city of Tokyo. In the process, a stray beam hits the chopper that the Prime Minister is in, killing him instantly. And finally, when all of Tokyo is blazing and melting, Godzilla's breath subsides. This is the coolest scene in a Godzilla movie ever. The visuals combined with the music just goes so unbelievably hard. And so with its energy fully depleted, Godzilla stands and rests, and for the time being, surrounded by the inferno of his own making, the incarnate God sleeps. From the air, the city is nothing but a burning bright glow, and radiation levels in the city center are extremely high. The government is crippled, the Prime Minister and many other ministers are all dead. Millions of citizens are now displaced, and a new government headquarters has been established. And in the absence of anyone else, the Minister of Agriculture is the new acting Prime Minister. We then cut to him to see what he's like, and it's probably bad news. He seems more concerned with the fact that his noodles are cold than concerned about the massive eldritch being that has destroyed almost the whole of Tokyo. The task force reassembles. More than half of them have returned, and many of them believe that Yaguchi himself would be a great prime minister when this crisis is over. But he's not so sure about that right now. His duty, at least for the time, is to take on responsibility when needed. But prime minister at this point in his career would be a tremendous responsibility. I need a drink. I'll be right back. Yaguchi gives a speech about those they have lost and how they need to return to work in order to stop this thing. And so they all do. And laboratories have begun developing the coagulant that they've formulated. They send a drone to observe Godzilla and take radiation readings. It appears that the radiation levels have subsided, and this huge cloud of radiation that Godzilla had produced has now blown out to sea. And so Yaguchi and Kyoko meet with the new prime minister. It appears the Chinese and the Russians all want a piece of Godzilla as well, and they and many other countries are lobbying for a multinational cooperative effort in researching Godzilla. Kyoko, however, wants to keep this operation exclusive between Japan and the US. And so they all agreed to continue this coalition. And so the new task force made of the Japanese task force and American task force all send another drone to study Godzilla. This one loses contact. It appears that Godzilla has some form of biological radar that lets him identify and eliminate these little targets. And on the ground, researchers find more tissue samples of Godzilla to study. And they don't show this in the movie, but there are deleted scenes of these like massive chunks of flesh having like eyeballs and teeth and stuff. It really does feel like this version of Godzilla is like a giant teratoma almost, or every cell in his body is capable of producing any kind of structure needed, which is horrifying. I hate it. But from this, they find out that Godzilla is capable of asexual reproduction, meaning he can simply divide off of himself to reproduce and make more of him. This opens the horrifying possibility of Godzilla simply multiplying and consuming the Earth. This trait can also be used to alter his biology drastically. This can mean growing rapidly in size or sprouting wings. The horrifying truth is that anything is possible, and that is not good. And now Yaguchi and Kayoko have a private conversation. It seems that for the US, the best option that they are considering is to, of course, just nuke the creature. They have predicted there is a chance that Godzilla could eventually make landfall in America, and that simply will not do. Not on my good American soil. This is God's country, you can't take it. I'm Canadian, by the way. And so the US has talked to the United Nations about a multinational assault on Godzilla. Kayoko was ordered to evacuate by her superiors in Washington in order to avoid the bomb, but she has chosen to stay behind because she does not want to see a third atomic bomb dropped on Japanese soil, which is completely fair. And as she says this, photos of the original bombings are shown on screen. It is a wonderful nod back to Godzilla's origin as an allegory for the atomic devastation. Meanwhile, the new prime minister, who it seems just does whatever America tells him to do, is preparing the country for a nuke to be dropped on Tokyo. The new cabinet doesn't like this option, but they will need the cooperation of foreign aid in order to rebuild after Godzilla's attack. And so they need to play nice with other nations in order to receive that help. Once again, while this is a critique of the Japanese government, it does build a level of empathy for the impossible situation they were given and does a good job at showing that they're trying to do their best. But in order to approve this, a new law has to be passed granting emergency powers to the Prime Minister, which... that doesn't sound familiar at all. The Prime Minister clearly doesn't want to have nuclear weapons used against Tokyo, as he looks out the window somberly saying this is not how he wanted to be remembered. Yaguchi protests this, insisting they are making great progress on the freezing plan, but like I said, Japan will need the cooperation of other nations in order to rebuild, and so for now at least, they have to play along. And of course, the task force doesn't take this news well. They aren't even sure if nuking Godzilla will even work. One member of the task force asks the terrifying question of what if Godzilla is simply just immortal at this point? Or what if it's evolved past the point where nukes would work on it? Then they would be bombing Tokyo for nothing. The UN has allowed time for a full evacuation to take place, and so the task force will continue using that time to develop the Yaguchi plan, in the hopes that they can do it before the bomb is dropped. They have a coagulant that will work. Now, all they need is 672 kiloliters of that fluid, which, for all of you science nerds out there, is a lot. In scientific terms, that is one bunch of fluid. That is exactly one of fluid. And while they continue working on this development, Godzilla's core begins heating up again. The slumbering giant is very slowly waking up. This news has of course reached the Prime Minister. In 2 weeks, Godzilla will return to its full strength. And then we cut to the White House. They are discussing pulling back all of their forces in preparation for the nuclear strike. Japan has 2 whole weeks to evacuate. This is not a lot, and certainly nowhere near enough to evacuate millions of citizens. Traffic is fully blocked for miles as citizens desperately try to evacuate. They are currently dealing with a food shortage, and housing prices in Western Japan are skyrocketing because of the mass migration. And at this time, a member of the task force meets with a journalist. In exchange for insider knowledge on Godzilla, this journalist has dug up everything that he can about the biologist Goro Maki. Hope you haven't forgot about him, because he's important. Goro hated radiation sickness. His wife was killed by exposure to materials that they were told were harmless, but in the end she succumbed to sickness and died. And so he tried to hide his findings about Gojira from the Department of Energy because they were linked with this radiation. He then left his message on the boat to be found and then disappeared, presumably drowning himself in Tokyo Bay. Oh yeah, it's 5:30, isn't it? Oh, so much more. We might have to take a pause for dinner. I'm very sweaty. But I look great. We're pausing now. Bye. The task force continues to pore over the chart of Godzilla's molecular structure. It is still just as baffling to them as when it was first unveiled. That is, until they have a revelation, because found with all of Goromaki's notes was an origami crane. If they take this chart and fold it in certain areas, it becomes a diagram for Godzilla's molecular conversion. Don't ask me how this works. This is probably not how it works in the real world, but origami molecular chart. I love science. Using this, they determine that Godzilla is a mixotroph. In other words, an organism that gains its energy or derives its energy from multiple sources. It converts water, it converts oxygen, it uses nuclear fission. Basically anything. This is a revolutionary discovery in terms of cellular biology. If only that discovery wasn't about to destroy all of Tokyo and potentially the world. And also with this discovery comes the potential that the coagulant they're developing won't work. And so they put to work a bunch of supercomputers to solve this issue. And finally, when those computers are done their calculations, they discover the full extent of Goromaki's research. Godzilla's body is entirely composed of extremophiles. What are extremophiles? I'm glad you asked. An extremophile is an organism that can survive extreme conditions. They are virtually indestructible, at least by the means or elements that we know. You might have heard of tardigrades, or by their other name, water bears. Those are those tiny microscopic organisms that can survive the vacuum of space and withstand cosmic radiation, like insane stuff like that. Those are also examples of extremophiles. Not only is Godzilla capable of spontaneous evolution, but every cell of his body is virtually indestructible, and that is very bad news. However, this does mean that the coagulant is viable. With all of this in mind, they request that the Prime Minister approve the execution of the Yaguchi plan, which might be more difficult than anticipated because the nuke has already been approved. It seems that the US wants Godzilla dealt with quickly so that they can cover up all of their prior knowledge of this creature. But after some back and forth, the acting Prime Minister officially approves the execution of the plan. Meanwhile, on a jet, Kayoko meets with another American diplomat. He is discussing the dropping of the bomb and how the work that Kayoko has done here could advance her own political career back home. And she brings up the fact that the Japanese are currently planning to try and freeze the creature. And then he gives the normal politician response of like, oh, I don't want to, but the Poles say that I should use nukes and the other nations are on board, so my hands are tied. He then directs the pressure onto her. If she allows the defeat of Godzilla to be a Japanese victory rather than an American victory, then all of her aspirations of being president one day may be shattered. However, she chooses the Yaguchi plan and leaves to oversee it. In addition, she offers US troops and US equipment should the team need it. With that, the coagulant is fully ready for deployment and the time for execution has come. And then Yaguchi gives this brave rallying speech to all of the men in radiation scrubs. There is a high probability that many will die from either the radiation or Godzilla's atomic breath, but the work is necessary and the reward is far greater. The future of Japan and possibly the world rests on them, so they need to get to work. They begin by waking Godzilla up with exploding trains at his feet. Then they use US drones provided by Kayoko to try and bomb Godzilla. It of course responds with its dorsal beams that eliminate all of the bombs and all of the drones. However, this is a good thing. The goal isn't to destroy Godzilla with these bombs. Dorsal beams finally subside, but he is not done yet. Godzilla then launches an atomic attack through its tail and its mouth. And so they send in the 6th wave, and finally Godzilla's body temperature drops and his atomic attack subsides. With its energy depleted, they set off controlled explosions in the buildings around Godzilla with the goal of Godzilla's mouth. They give him 30% of the dosage, but he wakes up just enough to wipe out the entire team. Godzilla stands and begins walking again, and they fully administer the complete dose. When suddenly, Godzilla wakes up and grabs a bunch of cranes in his mouth as he goes. It steps through another building, its back powering up for another atomic attack. Every cell in his body hardens, rendering him fully. It's not made of calcium now.
Sweet, sweet calcium
would play a big role in that new government. Then Yaguchi and Kyoko have their final meeting of Godzilla. Yaguchi admits that he shared their information on Godzilla with other nations so that more than just the US are aware of what this creature was, which was probably for the best. And Kyoko hopes that one day she will be present displaying the power dynamic in a visual medium, and I love it. And as he reflects, he says very ominously that this is not over yet. There is still the potential that the plan could fail down the road and Godzilla may yet break out again. We then cut to the frozen Godzilla, but something is off. One look at his tail and you can tell that it is visibly frayed, but with what? We then get a close-up of that tail and are shown something horrifying. Sprouting out from the tail of Godzilla are these contorted, almost human-looking forms. Beings with sharp teeth, dorsal spines, and arms and legs. And before we can even process what we are seeing, we cut to the credits. And that concludes the story of Shin Godzilla. This version of Godzilla is my favorite that I have ever seen. It is a cosmic horror veiled in a political thriller. And this version of Godzilla is beyond anything that came before or since. He is more than a monster or a spirit of vengeance. He is power and he is nature. An eldritch being of unlimited potential, stopped at the very precipice of ushering in a new and terrifying world. This movie is so fascinating to me because of that potential. Just beneath the events of this movie lies another story, a story of what might have been and what was yet to come. And so now we will be talking about the horror and the tragedy beneath the surface of Shin Godzilla. This version of the character is the most terrifying to date in terms of its appearance, its destructive power, and its destructive potential. And in that final shot of the movie, we almost see that realized as these twisted human forms branch off of the tail of Godzilla. From the movie, we know that Godzilla's biology is rapidly evolving, both in response to threats, but also spontaneously. And if they had not managed to freeze Godzilla when they did, things could have gotten much worse. As the final shot shows us, if Godzilla had been allowed to continue to exist, it would have become the progenitor for a new apex species, an army of humanoid creatures that are just as invulnerable and capable of rapid evolution as their creator. Godzilla may not have been a literal god, but to this new race of humanoids, he would have been their god, their creator. And while the future of the human race with this species is up to speculation, it is my personal opinion that had they been allowed to spread, they would have wiped humanity out. If these events had come to pass, there was no way that humanity could survive. And as horrific as that thought is, the worst part is that it wouldn't have stopped there. See, there is official concept art from the movie that speculates on what future forms this monster could take. Because the terrifying truth is the possibilities are endless of what new and horrible things could evolve out of this monster. One concept piece in particular shows the evolution of Godzilla. The first 4 stages are the stages that we see in the film, from its tadpole form to the form that we see at the end of the movie. But this is not the end, because this concept art also speculates on 4 other stages that might have come after. The next form we see is the humanoid creatures from the end of the movie. I don't think that Godzilla himself would have taken this form. I think this is more a reference to the 5th stage being him becoming the creator of this new horrible species. This would then propagate throughout the earth and inevitably, at least in my mind, destroy humanity. The next form takes on a much more jagged look. All of the bones and muscles and fibers of this creature have been pushed fully to the outside of its skin. And as it nests, it perpetually vomits gallons of blood that its body no longer needs. And the final evolution from this piece of art is what appears to be Godzilla's apex form. It is twice the size of the final version of Godzilla we see in the film, and its skin is a lot more metallic, so it can be assumed that this version of the character is even more invulnerable than 4th stage Godzilla was. If 4th form Godzilla was a nationwide calamity, then 8th form Godzilla would surely be a global calamity. Pair this with his army of Godzilla humanoids, and that is a truly terrifying future. But again, the horrifying potential of a creature that rapidly evolves on a dime like this is that this may not even be the end. And there is one proposed final evolution of Shin Godzilla that terrifies me above all the others. One piece of official concept art depicts the back of Godzilla cracking open, and out of its split back emerges something unexpected. Adorned in crystals or spines depending on the artwork is a giant, almost feminine-looking human form. This being glows with tremendous light, and its hands are folded in front of it as if in meditation. In some depictions, the face is more human-like, but in others it takes on a far more eerie quality. With the human race devoured, this planet would then be ruled by the offspring of Godzilla, not in a Judeo-Christian sense, but much more in an Eastern philosophical sense. And that to me is the true horror of Godzilla, the horror of what could have been, because there are a couple stories lurking beneath the surface of the events of Shin Godzilla that give the movie a much more tragic outlook. The first one is a lot more noticeable than is the second one that I will talk about, and that is the fact that Godzilla is in constant pain throughout this. It a series of rapid evolutions that would leave any creature in agony. Firstly, since humans can get a tremendous amount of pain just from growing a few inches. Now imagine the pain that would be felt for an organism growing hundreds. When it first arrives in the bay, you can see that it is sloughing its way onto the shore. You can see that its movements are not of a malevolent, destructive creature, but of an animal that is in a blind panic. The creature is in pain, struggling. Each transformation is so rapid that it must be incredibly painful. And then there is the element of Godzilla being powered by nuclear fission. Imagine your core body temperature being at the very least 600 degrees Celsius, probably far more considering the destructive power of Godzilla's atomic attacks. Godzilla's body temperature is probably excruciatingly painful, and it has to live in that perpetual state of being burned alive yet not allowed to die. One of the tragedies of Shin Godzilla is that its mere existence implies its own suffering. And another tragedy comes from an unaddressed point in the story, and that is what happened to the biologist Goro Maki. And I have a theory about this. It may be a little out there and it may sound crazy, but first, let's revisit all that we know. He started out as a professor of biology in Japan, and during this time, his wife passed away due to radiation sickness. It is never specified how she got sick. and sometime afterward he was expelled from Japan. It is unknown whether it was because his grief made him a risk, or maybe he started digging into the reason that his wife died and the government didn't like that, but in any case, he was exiled from his home country. He then traveled to America, where he began employment at a nuclear energy company. And during this time, he started conducting research into illegal dumping of radioactive waste in the Pacific Ocean. The implication of this, I believe, is that it is this waste that somehow led to his wife's death. And during his studies, he became aware of this ancient underwater creature, one that was not only acclimated to the radioactive waste and the water around it, but began to feed off of that waste. He named the creature Gojira, which on his home of Odo Island means God incarnate. He attempted to publish his work, but was censored by the Americans. They stole all of his research and anglicized the name to Godzilla. So at this point, he has been silenced and rejected not only by the Japanese, but by the Americans as well. We never actually see him in the movie, but I imagine that this would leave him very depressed and very angry. And the next we hear of him is in the first scene of the movie. His boat is found off the coast of Tokyo Bay with his personal effects and a note that says, "I did what I want, now you do the same." And the implication is that here in the bay, he jumped into the water to drown himself in the hopes of finally being reunited with his wife. These are the only known facts about Goro, but there is enough here to speculate on. One of the theories that many fans hold is that Goro used his knowledge of Gojira to somehow unleash it on the city of Japan, on the city of Tokyo, and then took his own life afterwards. The main evidence for this being that the first sighting of Gojira was in the exact same location as his boat. And this is a great theory, but I do believe that it could possibly go even deeper than that. I have my own theory, but in order for it to make sense, I need to revisit a detail that I glossed over in describing this movie. See, the director Hideki has been very open about his struggles with depression in the past. It is that same depression that initially caused him to turn down making this movie in the first place. However, the same reason he took the project was because of the same element in his life that allowed him to overcome these struggles, and that is his marriage to his wife, Mayoko Anno. In much of Hideki's work, he channels the slew of negative emotions that come with his depression into his artwork, but he also manages to channel his love for his wife into what he makes. As a writer, it is very common to write pieces of yourself, emotions you are feeling, or experiences into your work. And I believe that the manifestation of Hideki's depression and his love was all manifested in the character of Goro Maki. The biologist who lost his wife was a stand-in for Hideki himself. And while the beats of his story aren't representative of exact events in Hideki's life, the raw emotion is still at the core of what this story is telling. And so with that comparison established, here is what I think happened to Goro Maki. I think that Goro's wife died as a result of exposure to radioactive waste in the Pacific Ocean, the same waste that would later be the spawning ground for Gojira. And I think he was expelled from Japan because he was trying to expose the government's cover-up of this radioactive waste. They inadvertently caused his wife's death, and they removed him from the country in order to silence him. In America, he dedicated his time to researching this dump site, becoming obsessed over the years. And in his studies, he comes across a new form of life surviving in these radioactive materials. A creature that is strong and resilient, just like his wife was when battling this illness. And with that, his obsession deepened even further. He tried to publish his findings on this creature with impossible biology, but was censored by the Americans. They stole all of his research and named the creature Godzilla. He was outraged at Japan and at America, But at the root of it all, he was curious. There was something very familiar about Gojira, something that he didn't immediately register, something that lured him closer even though he didn't know what it was at the time. I don't know when or how, but I believe during this time he came to a revelation that called him back to his home country of Japan. He got on his yacht, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions spiraling through his head. He was angry at Japan, angry at America, and still grieving the loss of his wife. But he couldn't shake the feeling of some intrinsic connection to this creature in the deep, a creature that seemed to be birthed out of the same place where his wife was killed. And out of this turmoil of emotion, a thought occurred to him. The same thought that I had in doing my theory crafting for this video. Somehow contained in the form of this monster of Gojira was the spirit of his departed wife. This is not an unprecedented move. I talked about in my Godzilla tier list video the movie Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, which is still a lot to say. And in that movie, Godzilla was possessed by the spirits of all the soldiers who died in the Pacific War. And so to me, it is entirely possible that Gojira in this movie, in Shin Godzilla, somehow contains, maybe is not possessed by, but somehow contains the spirit of Goro's wife. And another reason that I believe this is in the concept art for the final form of Shin Godzilla. The reptilian shell would break away to reveal a powerful and serene female spirit. The soul of Goro's wife made flesh through impossible mutation. And I do have a third piece of evidence I think backs me up that I will talk about after I've woven this whole story. This was why he felt so connected to Gojira. On some emotional, intangible level, the two lovers could still feel each other, still on Earth and still out there. It is this connection that brings Gojira to Tokyo Bay and back to her beloved. Goro looked upon Gojira in the flesh, and he could see with his heart that his wife was there. He also saw that the creature that she had become was in constant agony, a mutated abomination whose body was ripping itself apart. His wife was not only still on Earth, but enduring relentless and indescribable pain, and he was powerless to stop it. In this moment, while he knew he didn't have a way of helping her, he thought that it might be possible to join her. Consumed by his grief and his love for his wife, he jumped into the bay, hoping that their souls could be reunited. However, I do not think that this succeeded, and he instead drowned in front of his wife. Scared, confused, grieving, and blinded by pain, Gojira then went onto shore, not out of malice, but driven to extremes by its own biology, as well as its physical and emotional suffering. So that's my theory. Gojira is the tortured spirit of Goro's wife, and he died in an attempt to join her in this suffering. This is a very tragic story, but don't worry, I'm not done yet. See, one counter argument you may have to this theory is if she is an innocent spirit inside of a creature, then why would she cause so much destruction in that really cool scene that we just saw? Surely she wouldn't do this if she were only scared and in pain. This is opera that plays during that entire scene. The song is called Who Will Know, and it is sung from the perspective of Godzilla itself. And so if my theory is correct, this is a song sung by the very spirit of Goro's when its life is genuinely threatened and it is made to bleed. With all that in mind, let us get into the lyrics of me. I am lost, no one knows. There's no trace of my yearning. She doesn't want to die because if she does, then no one will truly know the agony that she is feeling. She doesn't helpless to stop it. She is seen as the call and a response, and the response is this. But I must carry on. Nothing worse can befall. All my fears, all my tears, tell my heart there's a hole. The first voice speaks about her sadness, but the second represents her will to survive. When faced with weapons that can hurt her and that could kill her, she is forced to fight back. She is terrified, and so she fights desperately to survive. I believe the hole in her heart is a reference to Goro, who took his own life in front of her, and now it is her turn to carry that grief. We then come to verse 3. I wear a void, not even hope. A downward slope is all I see. This speaks to the melancholy and the resignation of her fate. She is forever destined to inhabit this body that causes her intense pain and suffering, and also causes destruction. Has the same quote, but also a response. All I need to cease the darkness killing me. Despite her hopelessness, she is forced to carry on. She doesn't want to kill anyone, but she also doesn't want to die, and because of that, she must keep attacking. Shaft of light is all she needs to prevent the darkness of humanity. This is the ultimate tragedy of Shin Godzilla. It is a tortured soul forced to fight in order to keep living an existence of pain. An existence just because of how tragic it is, but because it lurks just beneath the surface of a totally and completely different story. If you watch this movie without looking for it, you may miss it entirely. You may watch a movie fate so tragic. While Godzilla had to be frozen or beaten in some way to save the human race, Godzilla did not want to create a new race that would destroy humanity. That was a byproduct of ever in pain and forever separated from her love. Of course, all of the evidence for this is circumstantial. If you're a Five Nights at Freddy's fan out there, you're used to this at this point. Even if the soul theory is wrong, the song is "He Wants to Live," which is still very tragic, even if it is not the soul of Goro's wife who is singing it. And so with that, we have the story scene purely because of the sheer amount of layers to this story. It is a transcend reality as we know it. It is a scathing indictment of the Japanese government's lack of action in the face of unprecedented disaster. It is also the tragedy of lost love and a creature that is in constant pain and forced to forever destroy. There is so much in this movie, and I love it. It is my favorite interpretation of the character of all time. And for a third time, I have not seen Godzilla -1, so that does not count yet. So with all that said, I hope that you enjoyed, and thank you so much for watching 2024. Happy New Year's, everyone. I hope you all are celebrating Christmas and also getting together with some friends to just enjoy that I've been sick for a while. I think that's everything. Thank you all so much. This is the last Godzilla video, at least for a while. I don't have any plans on future Godzilla videos, but I do have plans for some really cool videos, and I hope that you'll stick around. Here they are, Sean and my top tier patrons, RD and Snowy. Thank you both so much for supporting me channel. And if you want some exclusive benefits, a weekly live stream, Happy New Year, everyone. I hope 2024 is a fantastic year for you all, and I will see you later for another amazing video. I hope you're excited for that because I know that I am. And cut.